Good morning, students. We're continuing to look at the federal courts and the judicial branch, and today we're going to be talking about what I think is very interesting on the Supreme Court. And why does the Supreme Court matter so much? Well, there are only 9 justices on the Supreme Court. The original court had 5, but the current court has 9 justices on the Supreme Court. And they have the last word on what the Constitution, the law of the land, means. Alex de Tocqueville, who you see there, has written his Democracy in America in 1830. A more imposing judicial power was never constituted by any people. And so the Supreme Court really are the Supremes. And here we've already talked about who's on the Supreme Court. Here you have the 2015 and 2017, but you know that changed because Justice Kennedy, seated to the right of Justice Roberts, resigned, and he was replaced by Judge Kavanaugh, Justice Kavanaugh. And so these are, again, how they are set up, and we've talked about that previously. But today the Supreme Court looks like this, with Justice Roberts there in the middle, and then Clarence Thomas is the next oldest judge, and then Ruth Bader Ginsburg is the next oldest as far as tenure goes. Now, again, Ruth Bader Ginsburg is 86, I think, and Stephen Breyer here is 80, 81. But they're the oldest members, but Clarence Thomas has the most tenure. So you want to know who those 9 justices on the Supreme Court are. The Supreme Court was originally held in rather low esteem, and over time it has gained prestige and authority. Hamilton, who you will recall wrote the Federalist Papers, a part of them, in Federalist 78 through 83, described the federal judiciary as the weakest of the 3 departments of government, of federal government. You'll recall the other 2 are the legislative branch, the most powerful, the executive branch, which was charged with implementing the legislature, and then finally the judicial branch. Hamilton wrote, "Limitations on the powers of government can be preserved in practice no other way than through courts of justice, whose duty it must be to declare all acts contrary to the manifest tenor, obvious meaning of the Constitution void. Without this, all the reservations of particular rights or privilege would amount to nothing." So he saw it as a very integral part of the system. And the first court was actually not the first Chief Justice, but the second Chief Justice was John Marshall. And in 1801, John Adams appointed John Marshall as Chief Justice. Marshall had been his Secretary of State, and he was a Federalist with an expansive federal view of the Supreme Court and wanting to more and more to play an important part. He stayed on as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court for 34 years. And during his tenure, the Supreme Court became an equal partner along with the executive and the legislative branches in the federal government. Probably, as we've talked about before, the most important case, the most significant case was Marbury versus Madison. Landmark case on page 75 in your book, occurred in 1803. And in that case, the judiciary, that is the Supreme Court, declared a portion of the Judiciary Act of 1789 unconstitutional, and thus asserting the court's right to declare something unconstitutional. And it also denied Marbury's claim to Justice of the Peace post, which he had been appointed to by John Adams. And some people said Thomas Jefferson, Democrat and Republican, won the battle but lost the war. And so judicial review comes out of the case of Marbury versus Madison. And that's in your text, and I would encourage you to read over that particular case. Another very important case was Marbury versus Madison and McCulloch versus Maryland. In 1816, Congress had chartered the second Bank of the United States. Some thought that was a bad idea. but it went through, and in 1818, the state of Maryland passed some legislation in their state to impose taxes on that bank. And they, when the administrator of that bank in Maryland refused to pay taxes, James McCulloch, they sued him. And so it went to the Maryland District Court, it went to the appellate court, and both of them decided for Maryland. The question was, did Congress have the authority to establish the bank? That was one question. And did Maryland unconstitutionally interfere with those congressional powers? It was a unanimous decision. John Marshall wrote the decision for the federal government and the national bank. He said the power to tax involves the power to destroy. And so a state does not have the power to tax a federal entity operating within that state. This particular case made the Necessary and Proper Clause, Article 1, Section 8, a powerful tool for expanding the implied powers of Congress, because nowhere in the Constitution does it say that Congress can establish a national bank. However, Congress can tax, they can gain money, so it was implied that they had the power to do this. And you can read all about this again in your text. A very important third case is Gibbons versus Ogden. This occurred in 1824, and it involved interstate travel. The steamboat owners operating in New York and New Jersey. And this is an important case too. The unanimous decision was for Gibbons. You can read about this in your text. And he asserted that the federal government's power to regulate interstate commerce using the Commerce Clause in Article 1, Section 8. So when you have state laws and you have federal laws, when it comes to interstate commerce, that is commerce between states, the federal law takes precedent. And you can again read about that in your text. Another significant case, Dred Scott. Democrats had emphasized states' rights, and they had dominated from 1800 to 1850. Chief Justice was Roger Taney at the time in 1857, and the Supreme Court ruled on Dred Scott. You can read all about the significance of this decision, but basically, short view is Scott at one time had been taken to a free territory. You recall, before the Civil War, there were free states and there were slave states. He'd been taken to a free state, but he was still a slave. And he sued saying, hey, because I've been taken to a free state, in that free state I'm no longer a slave, I should have been set free. Well, the Supreme Court disagreed. They said, territory, it doesn't matter if a man takes his property, which a slave was, to a free territory, he's still his property. And they struck down the Missouri Compromise as unconstitutional. And it ultimately led to the Civil War. And then from Reconstruction after the Civil War to 1930, you'll recall that the Amendments 13, 14, and 15, the Reconstruction Amendments were passed that outlawed slavery, established African American citizenship, and guaranteed the right of voting for folks like who had been former slaves or for African Americans. And then in 1896, along came Plessy v. Ferguson, a very significant case. There had been a Louisiana law that required separate but equal railroad cars for blacks and whites. And Homer Plessy, he was 7/8 Caucasian white. That means he was 1/8 black. He sat in a whites-only car, refused to move. The question then was, is Louisiana's law mandating racial segregation on its trains an unconstitutional infringement on both the privilege and immunities and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment? Well, the Supreme Court said no. You can have separate but equal. Vote 7-1. And as long as the black car and the white car are equal, that's fine. You can segregate. You can put the blacks in one and whites in another. And again, you can read more about that in your book. I would encourage you to do so. From the 1950s to the present, Chief Justice Earl Warren, who was appointed by Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower said, they asked him if he had made a mistake as president. He said, yes, I made 2 of them, and they're both sitting on the Supreme Court. He didn't like some of Earl Warren's decisions. Brown versus Board of Education, desegregated the public schools. Eagle versus Vitale, school prayer had been constitutional right up until 1962 when the Supreme Court decided, we better not pray in schools. Abington Township versus Shipp, students had been reading the scriptures in school all throughout American history up until 1963. And then Gideon versus Wainwright, Miranda versus Arizona, expanded the rights of those accused of crimes. Tinker versus Des Moines in 1969. Schools could not prohibit students from protesting Vietnam. And then in 1980, Stone v. Graham, the posting of the 10 Commandments in schools was prohibited because the Supreme Court said that if they're posted in the schools, the students might read them. And that would not be what school is all about. So, at any rate, some bad decisions, I think. Let's talk a little bit about the justices, as they're called. Due to the length of tenure, they serve for life, it can alter a nation. First of all, the president chooses a nominee, and he faces those 4 things: the legal expertise, party affiliation, judicial philosophy, and acceptability. Will the Senate confirm them? And then, once they're selected and nominated by the president, they go to the Senate for confirmation. They pass through first the Senate Judiciary Committee. The American Bar Association writes a report on them, and then the full Senate will vote on them. There have been 28 nominees rejected since 1789, only 28, but that's a significant number. And of course, the left really tried to get both somewhat Gorsuch, but especially Brett Kavanaugh rejected, but he now sits on the Supreme Court. And just a little cartoon there. When you're going up, you better be ready for some testing if you're going to be a Supreme Court judge. How does the Supreme Court operate? Well, it operates as does the fiscal year. It begins October 1st, and this one goes through June, not September. But first Monday is in October through June or July. Work is divided into 2 blocks, 2-week blocks. First 2 weeks, justices are on bench listening to arguments. The next 2 weeks, they're behind doors, meetings and deciding which cases to hear, issuing orders or such as that. And each justice is assisted by 4 clerks, which are very intelligent students of the law. Usually have just graduated from law school and really keen on advancement. Selecting cases, the Supreme Court only hears a few original cases. Most come through the federal appeals, in which they decide for a writ of certiorari. That's an order from the Supreme Court or from one higher court to a lower court saying, yeah, we will hear an appeal. And a few appeals come from the state Supreme Courts, but most of them come from the appellate system. Justices will choose 80 cases from over 87 or 8,000. And the docket is what is the list of cases to be heard. They have briefs and oral arguments. Justices read and discuss, and then they will meet in private, and then they will produce their opinion. It may be in a majority opinion when the majority sign off on it. It could be a concurring opinion when they concur on the judgment but different reasoning, or there could be a dissenting opinion. And you want to be aware of that decision-making process. And then Plenary review is when the court reviews them in full.